Everybody, thank you so much for joining us on this special stream here. I got my friend Than Christopoulos. Am I saying that right, Than?
Christopoulos.
Christopoulos. Geez, I'm terrible. The Bayesian brawler from Exploring Reality.
Oh, I forgot my hat.
Yeah. So, if you guys aren't subscribed to Exploring Reality, definitely check it out. If you like my channel, we have some definite intersecting interest, as well as other things that are maybe outside of the normal domain of Testify. Than, you like to talk about theology, philosophy. Did you want to kind of just tell us a little bit about your channel?
Yeah, Eric, you kind of hit it on the nail. I do a little bit of everything. I'm not a specialist like Eric is. So Eric could hit the ball out of the park with me when it comes to New Testament stuff. I'm just kind of a guy that tries to dabble in everything. So I talk about philosophy, history, theology. I'm really big into like Bayesian epistemology. So yeah, go check out my channel. And then odds are, if you've wondered something, I probably have something related to the question you have. Otherwise, I like to take questions from people too. So if there's something you've wanted somebody to hit on a YouTube channel and they haven't, let me know. Shoot me an email.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks so much for coming on. And today we're going to be talking about a video from an up and coming atheist YouTuber called MindShift. He's really kind of exploded over the last year
I was
or
going to
so.
say, I don't know if I'd call him up and coming. He's got more subscribers than both of us combined.
Yeah, he does. And in a quick time too. I've been doing this for 3 years, man.
Yeah, not even a year.
He's lapping me here. So no, it's good. More power to him. Honestly, the more voices on this particular issue, I feel like the better. And so we just have he made a video on the Massacre of the Innocents, which is actually, today's the feast day of the Massacre of the Innocents. If you are Catholic or Anglican or Lutheran, I don't know exactly when the Orthodox celebrate there, but I know it's around this time. And of course it's Christmastide. And so what do you have? You have skeptics throwing out videos questioning the birth narratives. It's just kind of the normal thing that happens every year. And so, yeah, he did a video on the Massacre of the Innocents. He questions its historicity, but then he also discusses some problems. If it is true, does this make God a bad God? I mean, why would he lead the Magi to Israel only to come across King Herod, who is going to kill and slaughter, dozens of children or whatever, however many it was. And so, yeah, well, without further ado, we're just going to watch the video and then we'll just kind of pause and offer some commentary as we go along. And so, MindShift, if you're out there watching, hey, either one of us, I'm sure would be happy to have a discussion on these 100%. Issues. Yeah, if feel like reaching out to us. This is just feedback, us offering a Christian perspective. We're not looking to dunk or anything like that. So here we go.
Unless you want a ball.
Yeah,
sorry, that was really cringe.
Hey, me and you are like 5'6", so if we lower the rim, well, yeah. I like how you had to no, it's 5'7". You got to throw the extra. If we lower the rim to 8.5,
I need my extra inch, right?
Yeah, no, I hear you. So, all right, here we go.
Domes and an amazing palace for himself and all kinds of things that completely.
He's talking about Herod. I apologize. I'm dropping you guys in the middle of the video, and I had it edited to a certain point, but apparently it decided to play in a slightly different spot. He's just talking about what we know about King Herod and what he did, his accomplishments.
Completely changed the city. He built cities. The most famous city he built was probably Caesarea, which he built in just 12 years, which is a huge accomplishment for the ancient world. We know he built other cities. He had 7 strong fortresses, the biggest and best probably being the one in Masada. And so again, from a political standpoint, he was just killing it. But his personal life was kind of funky. And we know this, by the way, because of Josephus. Now, a lot of times, and I've gotten this comment just yesterday even, Jesus is the most well-attested figure in history. Wrong. It's King Herod the Great. Can you believe it? Even over Alexander the Great, over Jesus, over Paul, over any of them. Even ask Christian scholars. Josephus does 2 full book scrolls for Herod. So we have a ton of information. So we do know he had 10 wives, which means he had tons of potential princes that were having all of these fights and plotting and scheming and murdering to try to make sure they're next in line, etc. That would drive anyone to paranoia. And we do have good reason to believe from Josephus's accounts that this person, Herod, was indeed a bit paranoid. He killed his wives. He killed his mother-in-laws. He killed some of his own sons. We have records of him wanting and plotting and planning to kill a ton of the Jewish leaders. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that someone with this temperament would therefore go and also try to kill all the babies when he's heard about some prophecy of one of them turning into the next king of the Jews.
Okay. So I'll just pause right there. So far, just to be real clear, like, I don't disagree with anything. And if anything, I think he's showing that the prior probability of Herod doing something like this is pretty high. It's definitely on brand. Just to kind of throw out some other facts, he kind of glosses over, but Herod ordered the execution of Mattathias Antonigus. He was one of the Hasmonean leaders before him. So out of paranoia, he bumped him off. John Hyrcanus II, who was elderly at the time, also one of the Hasmonean people from that particular dynasty. He had him strangled. And so, like, definite bad guy. He had his brother-in-law, who was also the high priest, drowned in a swimming pool because he thought that his brother was more popular than he was. And he thought, if he's more popular than me, well, why wouldn't they want him to be king, right? He's right about the family members. He executed his own mother-in-law. And I'm going to refrain from any mother-in-law jokes there. But anyway, I'm just kidding. I have a great mother-in-law. So
man,
he had his second wife, Mirme, killed. He had his 3 sons out of that marriage killed. But I mean, it gets worse. He mentioned all that. He had 300 military leaders executed. There were some Pharisees who, around his elderly years, prophesied that his kingdom would not actually fall to his descendants. So he rounded them up and killed them too. He also, at the end of his life, at his funeral, he had all of the, he ordered that a bunch of people would be detained so that when he died, he ordered his family to basically kill him because apparently he didn't expect there to be a lot of mourning at his funeral. So he just had a bunch of people rounded up before he died. And then, after he died, it's like, okay, kill them all. Thankfully, his family members relented and didn't follow through with that and let him go. But he definitely wanted there to be mourning and grieving at his death, even if it wasn't for his own death. And so he didn't apparently expect too many tears to be shed. And so hunting down the prophesied baby king of the Jews is just completely on brand for what we know about King Herod. He was like a paranoid mob boss. So I think he makes some good points here. So it's weird to kind of see him go, but Josephus never says anything about this, which we're going to get into now. And so, Than, did you have anything you want to add before I jump to the next part?
Not right now.
Okay. All right, here we go.
I get it. We can't guess at this. And a lot of times the atheist who says, well, we have all this information from Josephus and look, they didn't mention the child killing. It is an argument from silence. And it's funny to see the Christian be the one who uses the logical fallacy against the non-believer in this particular situation. But I don't think it's just an argument from silence. First of all, if it is, it's one of the strongest ones ever because we, again, have so much information and such good record keeping about this particular individual that something as insane and heinous as just murdering random baby children to avoid a potential threat that clearly wouldn't even be of age to take over from you when you're clearly about to die just would be hard to fathom that doesn't get recorded, especially when you read Josephus's accounts and you see all the other minute details that were provided. Again, arguments from silence, not super strong. This particular one, though, one of the strongest. And when you mix that with the fact that the only evidence we have for the account is an anonymous gospel, and only in one of the gospels, by the way, and one that contradicts the other stories told in the gospels, and knowing that that anonymous gospel writer had bias and intention of why he was trying to create this story, we start to form a lot more than just an argument from silence. If it were up to me, I would much rather trust that an event did not happen, because one of the best historians ever in the ancient world, who made more notes about this individual than anyone else, did not include one of the most insane stories that would have happened, versus an anonymous, biased author trying to create something to fulfill prophecy, and bad, incorrect prophecy at that.
All right. So he just kind of makes his case like a lawyer there. Yeah, this one of the strongest arguments from silence. I mean, for me, I'm kind of wondering, like, how much has he looked into the history, especially with arguments from silence. And so, because, I mean, if you think, there are so many examples. People who have been watching my channel for a long time have heard these before, right? But like President U.S. Grant was, before being President U.S. Grant, was a Civil War general, right? He left a detailed diary pretty much daily, and he never mentions the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Herodotus and Thucydides are writing in the 5th century BC, right? Now, I get that Rome wasn't like this major power yet, but they were starting to be up and coming. They never mention Rome, okay? Thucydides writes during the period of Socrates. Socrates was around for 20 years when Thucydides was around. Never mentioned Socrates at all. Just doesn't mention him. Marco Polo was a famous explorer, right? He never mentions the Great Wall of China. He was in China, right? Grafton's Chronicles covers the reign of King John. He never mentions once the Magna Carta, right? And so, I mean, I could go on and on. Henry Oldenburg, right? During a severe plague in the 1600s, 1665 to 66, I believe. Much worse than the Rona that we're recently getting out of here. During the time of a severe plague, he sent multiple letters. The only time that he mentioned the plague was in a letter to Spinoza, explaining why he sent a book, and it took a long time for Spinoza to get it. And so to say, like, this is one of the strongest arguments from silence ever. I mean, I think just some of the examples that I'm giving right now, like Constantine, Eusebius covers all kinds of stuff about the life of Constantine, like detail after detail after detail after detail about Constantine's life. But he never mentions the death of Constantine's son Crispus or his wife Fausta. And so it's just like, I'm wondering how familiar, MindShift might be with some of these things. And so,
yeah, I always just tell people when it comes to this topic to read Tim McGrew's paper on the argument for silence too, because all the examples that you just cited, and the shoot, what's the guy's name? I forget the historian off the top of my head, but he doesn't mention Pompeii erupting.
Yeah,
That's
it's
another one he mentions.
Pliny the Younger, his letters to Tacitus, they describe the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but he never mentions that Herculaneum and Pompeii were actually destroyed, or the death count or anything like that.
Yeah. So the other thing I kind of wanted to point out here is one of the things that he mentions in that clip was that Josephus doesn't mention this huge event, right? And he goes on. I don't know if you have this part of the video clipped, but in the video he even talks about how, like, a lot of scholars will actually say that this took place in a city that would be very small and a population that'd be very small, right? So we're talking maybe 10 to 15 kids tops, right? That got killed. I find a disanalogy here, because he's talking about this as if it's a huge event, but then he's contrasting it with other events that were marginally bigger, like 300 people slaughtered. Not to mention like close family members slaughtered and all these other things. So I don't know that he's making this event to be as big as it is, but I don't know where you land the plane on that topic either. So
yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird. The thing is, too, is like Josephus never mentions the fact that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in 41 AD. And so we hear about it from Suetonius, like a century later. And interestingly enough, Luke just kind of mentions it in passing in the book of Acts. But that's kind of a big deal, right? Like the whole thing with a giant population of the city is just like get out, leave because you're Jewish. But he
Yeah.
never mentions that. You're right. Bethlehem's population was only about 300 people. Maybe the surrounding area could have been like 1,500. But we're talking about maybe a dozen baby boys. And then the thing too is that like how familiar is he with like just Roman culture? I mean, they used exposure like
Yeah.
like birth control the way that like some people use abortion as birth control. And like, you know, I'm not trying to start a whole can of worms with that, but basically, if you don't know what exposure is, it's just the woman.
They would toss like unwanted children by the river and hope that wolves would get them or something like that, or that the elements would kill them.
Yeah. There's a letter from a soldier named Hilarion to his pregnant wife that we have record of, where basically he's like, "Hey, I'm in Alexandria right now. Take care of the child, and I'm here. I'm sending you some money." He basically says, if it's a girl, kill it, but if it's a boy, let it live. Juvenal, a historian, says that there was sites for abandoned babies called milk columns, or filthy pools or cesspits. This is where they would just dump off their young. And then Ovid, another person writing around that time, talks about her husband again said, "Hey, if it's a girl, kill it."
Yeah.
And so this is the culture. These are the people that Josephus is writing to. Does he really think, even if he does know about it, and maybe he doesn't know about it, would he really think that they would find it interesting? There's good reasons to think that it's not. And so what we're seeing here, and you could maybe tackle this from a Bayesian perspective with just the argument from silence, and then just what we're bringing in with the facts here, the facts after what we know. It's totally on brand for Herod. It fits everything we know about his personality. And is this really something that Josephus would report? He doesn't talk about the expulsion of the Jews, and he's writing to a Roman audience who thought it was perfectly legit to stick babies out and let them die. It's kind of like this sad stories you hear about, like teenage unwed mothers throwing their babies in dumpsters. So, like, how could this possibly be called one of the strongest arguments from silence that one could make? Like,
well, that's a good segue question, I guess, for this, for you wanting me to talk about this from a Bayesian perspective, because one thing to think about when it comes to this is like our arguments from silence are essentially going to be contrastive, right? You're asking what's the probability, like we're pointing to a gap in evidence essentially as a data point that we're going to try to explain. So like, what's the probability of this gap given the hypothesis that this was a real account, and what's the probability of this gap given the hypothesis that this is a fabricated account? So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. That's how you want to think about this. The other thing is just going to be that I'm trying to think of the best way to popularize this. The strength of an argument from silence is going to be measured in terms of the ratio of those likelihoods, right? So what's the probability of this gap given the fact that it didn't happen, the hypothesis it didn't happen, divided by the probability that of this gap given the hypothesis that it did happen. And so what happens is, because of that, is like, because of the way that you measure these things, one of the things that's a consequence of this is that the only way that this argument is going to be a strong argument is if you have not just like a modest expectancy of this gap or this data point. In other words, like you have to have very, very good reason for expecting a near 1 probability that Josephus would mention this. Otherwise, this argument just doesn't really work. It's not strong at all because of the nature of that ratioing that needs to happen when you're measuring probability, again, in this Bayesian way. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not strong on the hypothesis, right, at
Yeah.
all. And so, yeah.
And so the last thing I'll just say on that aspect too is um you're dealing with agents here.
Mhm.
Like you're dealing with people, and there's just an indefinite amount of reasons why somebody would or wouldn't talk about something, right? Like just a textbook example. The other day I found a $50 bill. Um and my wife was initially surprised I didn't tell her about it because that's $50, and I was just like, "Oh, well, I wanted to surprise you by getting you something nice when I found a $50 bill." But like there's no reason that she would have like understood that as like a reason for me not telling her that until after she found that fact out about what my intentions were about why I didn't tell her that, right? But the historian then might look back at history and look at an account like that and be like, well, Than didn't mention the fact that he had $50, so he probably didn't have it. But it's like, well, that's nonsense. I just didn't mention not having the $50 because I had a reason to not mention it. And we just don't have access to those types of things. So it's kind of, that's why these arguments can be really weak.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the strongest ever argument from silence, I would say not even close. And so, but he says it's more than just an argument from silence. He kind of gives his reasons why. And so let's see what else he's got.
I should also note Herod has two sons that come up in the Bible, and we should just clear the confusion. His son Herod that shares the same name is Herod Antipas. This is not the Herod who commanded the child genocide, if that even happened. He has another son, Archelaus, who we do hear about in this exact same chapter. Matthew chapter 2 is where we get all of this story. Now, we're
all right, so just quick foreshadowing of stuff that we're going to talk about later, but I just want to expound on this slightly. And so we know what he's saying from Josephus. And so Archelaus was put under basically Judea, all that kind of stuff. Galilee, all that whole area north is where Antipas was going to be put over. Archelaus he didn't even adopt the title as king. And we'll talk about this a little more. He didn't have like his the official title given to him, and he hesitated to adopt it until he gained approval from Caesar Augustus. He had a reputation for cruelty, and people weren't really like excited about him ruling, which is again a little bit of foreshadowing. So just bear with me here, guys. And so yeah, when he did finally get control over a significant part of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea, he was only given the title ethnarch. He didn't have the same title as his father. And so Antipas even complained that Archelaus was too cruel. So again, a little foreshadowing for some information we're going to get to later. So just throwing that little history nugget out right now, and you'll see why it's relevant in a little bit.
We're not going to get into all of the different gospel contradictions around the nativity. There's so many, and there's a ton of history we can understand, like Mark is the first of the anonymous authors, and Matthew and Luke clearly both copied from him, though they changed up their stories for their own purposes. And again, I'm using their names, but these are anonymous writers. We know that these are not these actual individuals. And then John comes a few decades after and adds in a whole new concept of Jesus that is just totally radical to what we first see in Mark. So what we're going to see from Matthew is an attempt to reconcile tons of what he thought were good, legitimate Hebrew Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. This is after the fact editing. Just going through the story itself, I'll do the highlighted versions for you. It starts with the visit of the wise men in chapter 2. They've seen the star, they're on their way, and for some reason, plot device, they happen to stop at King Herod's place and say, hey, do you know where this new king is? That's not an insane question to ask the current king. That's something these wise men definitely would have done going out of their way as they follow the star. Sure, but this supposedly piques Herod's paranoia. He lies to the wise men and says, when you find him, come back and tell me because I want to worship him also. And supposedly the wise men believe this until they are warned by an angel not to and to go home a different route, which raises Herod's suspicion. And so he asks all his council, where is this baby to be born? They reference the prophecies. So again, giving extra credit to the prophecy that Matthew is trying to build for us and say, oh, he'll be born in Bethlehem. And this is where we get King Herod's order to kill all the baby boys in Bethlehem Bethlehem and the surrounding area. Now I'm going to read you this next part. This starts in 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. So that's the same day. The angel appears, and then they get up and they go to Egypt. By the way, here's an important part. Matthew does not hide his secrets well. He says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. So we know that Jesus has to be both a Nazarene, born in Bethlehem, and come out of Egypt, if we are even considering some of these Old Testament prophecies to even be talking about Jesus. But Matthew does, and so he's working for a way to make it happen. He also wants to show Jesus as that next great Moses character. Moses has a similar baby escape story. It just becomes so very obvious how hard Matthew is trying to create this, and he's not done. But I want to point out...
Okay. So
there's a whole lot there.
Yeah, there's so many problems.
I'll say this: like, you and I have both covered authorship of the Gospels a lot. So, for anybody curious, I think just look at Eric and I's work on that. I think he mentions this developmental Christology thing, and I didn't catch that until that playthrough, actually. But I just think that. I think that's just patently false. I mean, one, without even talking about the Gospel of Mark, Christology in Mark, you can just look at Paul, who is,
right.
I mean, he's writing before them. But also, like, I think Mark actually has some of the highest Christology, if not the highest Christology, out of the four Gospels. And those of you who watch my channel, I'm doing a series on that right now, strictly arguing from the chaos Kampf, and there's a lot of ways that Jesus is actually seen as Yahweh in the Gospel of Mark, in ways that you just wouldn't understand or miss really easily given your modern context, and not digging into some ancient Near Eastern like Second Temple contexts. So that's all I'll say there. Check out my series on that.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree with you 100%. I mean, Paul's letters, it's pretty explicit. Like, he says, if you believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead and confess him as Lord, you will be saved. And then he quotes, like 4 verses later, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Well, he's quoting Jude 2:32, which is a direct reference to Yahweh, and he's equating that with Jesus. And that's just one tiny example. We're not even talking about Carmen Christi from Philippians chapter 2, or all of the other ways that we could go to demonstrate that, like, Paul had an extremely high Christology. And I agree with you that Mark does too. I mean, he just even from the very first few passages, like, he basically, the way that John the Baptist refers to Jesus, he's quoting Isaiah 40, and he's like, make way, straight paths for the Lord. And he's like, no, make straight paths for him, referring to Jesus. And so that's like a very high Christology as well. And so I don't really buy the development stuff either. I mean, I sort of understand how they spin it, but it takes a good bit of cherry picking in order to do that. But yeah, were you going to say something, Dan? I'm sorry.
No, I realized that I said yeah, and then I was muted, and then I just got awkward. That's all.
just keeping it awkward. No, that's all good, man. And so, all right. So prophecy. So what MindShift is saying here is, okay, well, we see from the Bible, he must be a Nazarene, quoting Matthew 2:23. He quotes, Matthew quotes Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son. And he also refers to, Rachel weeping for her children in Jeremiah 31:15, right? There's a really big problem here with this whole idea that Matthew is just making up a story out of this prophecy. And it's that we have very meticulously documented Alfred Edersheim in a book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. He documents 456 passages from the Targums or the Talmud, Old Testament passages that were considered Messianic by the rabbis, okay, of around that time. Hosea 11:1, Jeremiah 31:15 didn't make the cut, okay? Where does it say in the Old Testament that the Messiah is going to live in Nazareth. Matthew kind of really stretches that one. Now, he does it in a way that I think is pretty tame compared to some of the stuff that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the other, like I said, the Targums, Talmud, and different things like that. They can kind of really get stretchy with the way they interpret the Old Testament. But the closest thing that scholars have pointed out as far as Jesus being from Nazareth, or the Messiah being from Nazareth or living in Nazareth at some point, is in Hebrews 11:1. It talks about the branch, or Hebrews, excuse me, Isaiah 11:1. Obviously, Hebrews is New Testament. Branch is translated Netzer, Nazareth. It's like a word play. It's like a pun. And even then, a lot of times people are like, I'm not, they're not even sure. Scholars aren't even sure. Okay. And so why would a first century Jew with Messianic fever pull these particular texts out of the Old Testament unless they were inspired by some sort of real events? Because otherwise there's no reason for them to do that, right? There's just no reason why an overly excited Jew would pick these passages to create a Messiah birth story, as they didn't really align with the anticipated narrative. And so Matthew's selection of these specific prophetic writings suggests that they fit the events if they actually occurred, right? That's the only way that this would actually work. And I'm not just making an apologetics talking point here. I've heard Mark Goodacre, a New Testament scholar from Duke University, who hosts the NT Pod. I don't know if he is a Christian. I don't think he's like an inerrantist or a fundamentalist at all. Make similar points. He usually presents things from an extremely neutral perspective. Okay. And so nobody would grab these particular strands unless they felt like out of necessity. And I think what Matthew is doing is he's just trying to scripturalize and give an interpretation based on actual events, based on things that he's actually heard about and is writing down, versus him just digging out Old Testament verses and creating stories. Because if that's what he was doing, he could have found different Old Testament passages that Jews agreed on were Messianic and created stories out of those. And so I just think that this is a really, really like not good argument at all. As far as like Moses parallelism, I do think Matthew might be sort of presenting Jesus as the new Moses. I know that's something that scholars just kind of widely agree on. I'm not saying that that typology isn't there. There's like a spiritual exodus and all that other stuff. There's something there. I'm not necessarily denying it. But if he was just trying to create a story out of Moses's birth narratives, he could have made it a lot closer. I mean, Moses doesn't have any older siblings that like kind of rescue him or anything like that, right? Obviously, he's the firstborn, right? He grows up in an ordinary home. Well, Moses grows up in a royal family, right? And so there's all kinds of differences. Pharaoh's concern is over the Jewish population, right? And so like he's dealing with an entire population. Herod is focusing on one child due to a supernatural tip-off, right, that he got. Pharaoh's making public policy here, whereas Herod is just kind of acting in secrecy and just kind of saying, hey guys, like go to Bethlehem and kill some babies. Not trying to make light of that. I know it sounds, I'm not trying to say that flippantly. It's sad, but it's just like that's basically what's happening. It's a secret thing. And so to me, I don't know, if he's trying to just spin a story and create parallels, you could have made him closer. But if he's finding parallels in Jesus's actual story and kind of like inviting the reader to discover those, that's fine. But he makes no explicit reference really to the Exodus at all. And so I don't think that it's a good practice generally to attribute theological motives to people unless they've given us good reason to do that. And like Matthew, he's just not even referencing that. And even if there were parallels, that wouldn't negate historical authenticity. I mean, we could draw parallels between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. There's all kinds of spooky similarities there. We know there was a fictional story about the sinking of the Titan and the Titanic that happened like 15, 20 years later. For those of you who don't know, there was a fictional novel called Futility by Morgan Robertson in 1898. It was noted for eerie similarities to real life sinking of the Titanic. I mean, it's named the Titan, for crying out loud. Both ships were 800 feet long, had a capacity of 3,000 passengers. They both collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. It happens in mid-April in both stories. There were insufficient lifeboats for passengers on board, and then, when we have all the Titanic memes now, been waiting 84 years or whatever. Anyway, sorry, that was terrible. But yeah, I mean, you guys kind of get it, right? There was fog, all of this stuff. And so even if there were parallels, that doesn't negate historicity. We draw parallels in history all the time.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm going on and on. Than, do you have anything you want to add to that at all? Or?
Not really. And I would just say that, like, it's not surprising that, but there's two things I guess I could say here. One is just, like, given this cosmic story of what Christianity posits, it's not, like, terribly surprising that there would be even some parallels in theological, like, tells or storytelling from any kind of supposed parallels. So I don't know that can actually be a marker against Christianity being true or some kind of historicity or anything like that, just because we kind of see that as being part of, like, the cosmic narrative. I forgot my second point. I'm still I'm so sorry.
no, you're fine. He's got the Rona brain. He's getting over it there. That's why he keeps muting on the cough there, which I think I might be getting over something too. I was telling him I've been kind of in a brain fog the last few days, but yeah, no, I totally agree. If God is the author of the story,
yeah,
why couldn't he draw parallels if he wanted to, right? People talk about, well, Elisha, he fed the multitudes with 100, he fed 100 people. That was one of Elisha's miracles.
Right.
Well, maybe the New Testament authors invented a story where he feeds 5,000 people because, man, that's so much bigger and so much better. Well, we have to look at the whole picture here. And we can't just say parallel, therefore ahistorical.
Yeah.
If God is the one who's orchestrating the story and he wants to show that Jesus is a greater prophet than Elisha, then why couldn't he himself create a parallel in a way where it's like, hey guys, this is how you recognize a prophet. Here's a prophet.
Yeah.
And so, like, just because there's miraculous stuff in the story, like visions and dreams or and people being saved through revelation or something like that, that doesn't automatically make the story false just because we can find a parallel. We have to look at, what other evidence do we have for the historicity or ahistoricity of these accounts? So,
yep.
All right, let's get him back here.
One inconsistency that comes up with Luke that shows that this can't be real and or the account in Luke can't be real. They're mutually exclusive. In Luke 2:22 through 40, we get the story of after Jesus' birth, and we know according to Jewish law, this would have been 40 days later that they present him in the temple. You can't immediately flee to Egypt and peacefully, calmly, 40 days later, go present Jesus in the temple. This 100% cannot be true. But for the sake of this...
Okay, so real quick point here. There are ways to harmonize this account, okay? And let's just say the attempts are really strained. If it's an error, like, what of it? And so to give a little bit of background, he kind of teases it out pretty well, but I'll just, make sure that everybody's on the same page here. Luke does indeed appear unaware of the flight to Egypt, right? Indicating potential differences in sources. It could be a hint that it's not historical, but it also could just indicate different potential sources. Luke 2:22 through 38 describes Jesus' temple dedication and Mary's purification, right? They had to do what was prescribed according to Leviticus 12, where a woman remained unclean for 40 days after giving birth. You have to give an offering of either 2 doves or pigeons, or I think there's like another kind of animal sacrifice that you can make. And so they picked the birds, the cheaper option. It was kind of an out for the poor. And it shows that they had some financial limitations, right? So Luke 2:39 implies a prompt return to Nazareth after purification. And I if you read the text, let's just grant that for the sake of argument. You might be right. It's definitely a very plausible reading. I won't argue that. Matthew, on the other hand, he hints this prolonged stay in Bethlehem because obviously the Magi come. It's probably 2 years old or maybe younger because that's what Herod says is 2 years old and younger, wipe them out, right? And so the Magi don't come contra nativity scenes right at the birth of Jesus. This is later, probably a year and a half later or something like that, right? And so Matthew hints at this prolonged stay in Bethlehem post Jesus' birth and later a return from Nazareth. This inconsistency would stem from Luke's sources not covering the Magi's arrival, the Bethlehem tragedy, or the Egypt trip. Now, I think this is just speculation. Let's just say this is an error again for the sake of argument. Luke may have derived his account from Mary or other family members of Jesus who might have heard some of these stories growing up, right? There's ample evidence, and I have a whole long stream if people want to go back and watch it, of why I think that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul and wrote the Gospel of Luke. I think the evidence for that is super strong, very compelling, okay? So I think it's a very strong possibility that he derived his story from some of Mary's family, Jesus' family members, because we know he met James in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 21. It mentions Paul was there, right? And then he spent 2 years while Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea Maritima, which is only 75 miles away from Jerusalem. So he had plenty of time to pull from sources and just read the prologue of Luke. He's obviously drawing from sources, right? And so maybe Mary just kind of explained some of this, and Luke was just kind of like, okay. And he just connected some dots in his brain. And he was like, well, they immediately went back to Nazareth. Okay. He just made a natural assumption. That's not the same thing as just making stuff up out of whole cloth. That's just a good faith error, even if it is an error. Again, I'm not saying this can't be harmonized and can't fit within a view of where you think the scriptures are totally inerrant. But even if it wasn't, this would be a good faith error. And neither is the silence of Matthew an indicator, as we've already kind of talked about, of some of this other stuff, or Luke, that this is just made up, right? And so yeah, like, I don't think you can take one contradiction and say totally invented, whole cloth, this whole story is made up. It's not how testimony works. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. Than, you got anything you want to add to that at all? No?
No,
Okay.
you said everything I would have said.
Okay. So yeah, I just this is just not the way historians do history. We don't just throw out a source because of one potential error, right?
Story. We're just going to keep going like Matthew knows what he's talking about. Then we get to chapters 16, where Herod actually does go and kill all these children. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise man, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. I think this is in Jeremiah 31, by the way. A voice was heard in Ramoth, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. I'm so sorry. Can someone actually explain to me how in Jeremiah this Rachel has anything to do with her mourning over her dead children with all of the children of Bethlehem and the surrounding area hundreds of years later? Like, what a ridiculous try. This is why I think it's such an insane thing when Christians are like, well, if you look at probability, one man fulfilling all of these prophecies, it's impossible. So therefore, Jesus is real? No, look how concocted and twisted these prophecies are. And then the last one here is the return to Nazareth, which starts in verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. So they were still in Egypt the whole time. When did they present Jesus in the temple again? Saying, rise, take this child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. But wait, didn't the angel just say, anyone who wishes his harm is dead? You're fine, go back? Then he hears that it's Herod's son Archelaus, which is apparently news to this angel. And the angel's like, oh yeah, let me give you another warning. I need you to actually go to Nazareth now. And why? Matthew tells us, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Matthew has angels making mistakes just to find a convenient way to get Jesus not only out of Egypt, but in Nazareth, all for the sake of trying to fulfill prophecy. So,
okay. So a lot going on there. which I think we already kind of tackled, right? Matthew's, why would he grab these threads again if they weren't based on the actual events? Because he's right. It does seem a little bit contrived. It does seem a little bit forced. I'm not going to use Jeremiah 31:15 or Hosea 11:1 or whatever the heck Matthew is talking about in Matthew 2:23 with he'll be a Nazarene as an argument from prophecy. Okay. But Robert Gundry, who is a respected New Testament scholar, has painstakingly analyzed the citations from the Tanakh found in Matthew's Gospel, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and Matthew is the one who, people say, oh, he's twisting it. He compares his usage to the Hebrew scriptures and that with the early rabbinic writings and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what he says is that Matthean hermeneutics were not atomizing, in contrast to Qumran and rabbinic literature. In other words, he's saying that Matthew cites verses from the Hebrew Bibles with more care for their original context than either the rabbinic writings or the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, that's not to say that Matthew is throwing out these passages like a normal New Testament scholar would, or just a pastor on Sunday and saying, yeah, this is great hermeneutics here. It is a little bit stretchy. It is a little bit odd. But again, why would you reach for these strands unless the events actually suggested them themselves? And so he's finding typology in different things like that. This isn't the same thing as Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 in Daniel chapter 9 and all of those other messianic prophecies, which you could build an argument for the messianic prophecy. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the positive evidence here that this actually. What were you going to say, Sam?
Yeah, there's just one thing I do want to say, because this is kind of this is one of my critiques of a lot of because a lot of people will try to make the type of argument he's making. One of my questions is just kind of which is it? Are the gospel authors forcing prophecy, or are they misreading the text, or is it that there's parallels and therefore this is evidence against historicity? A lot of these things that we're trying to mash up together are mutually exclusive. What are the gospel authors actually doing? And it seems like that mashup is happening here too. That's all.
Point
that out.
No, that's good. It's it is kind of theory laden.
Yeah.
Right. And when you're building kind of a weak hypothesis on top of another weak hypothesis, and
that kind of sets up the positive evidence thing that you want to go into.
Yeah, exactly. Because there actually is positive evidence for historicity in this particular case. And so just reading Matthew 2:22, it said when Joseph, now, first of all, I think he's misquoting some of the passages there. He has this dream and then the angel's oh, I didn't know about this, but this is news to me. It's very possible that God can leave kind of breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs? Is that what I said? Breadcrumbs.
It's okay. You're getting sick. It's okay.
Yeah, to lead somebody down the right way, just kind of guide them step by step. I don't think he's just kind of ad hoc, oh, whoops, that's a really uncharitable reading of the text. But Matthew 2:22, it says, when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Now, I already mentioned earlier that Archelaus had a reputation for being a jerk, right? He ended up being deposed in 6 AD for multiple complaints to Caesar. And he's just not a good dude, okay? The specific instance that would have troubled Joseph in particular actually fits with what we know from Josephus, but in a way that's really casual and really incidental and doesn't look like it's planned on purpose at all, because Matthew is going to make no mention of the facts that I'm about to make. But Herod the Great died around 4 BC. I mean, it's kind of debated a little bit, but obviously Herod died before Archelaus took over. And one of the things that Herod did is there were some Roman shields, and they had the eagle emblems on them, and they were over the temple. This was right before Herod died. It was during Passover, and that ticked off Herod or it ticked off the Jews, I should say, because they saw that as hey, this is idolatry. This is breaking the Decalogue. You can't have these Roman shields over the temple with these emblems of eagles on it. This is idolatry. And these Jews protested, and they took it upon themselves to tear down the standards off the temple. Well, that ticked off Archelaus, and the Jews who did that, he basically had them executed And next year, Passover rolls around again. And people are still upset about this. They're still talking about this. And tempers kind of start to flare. And there's some Roman soldiers who are kind of getting in an argument. Again, this is all in Josephus. And they basically start arguing. They throw rocks at the soldiers. And one of them gets stoned to death or something like that. I think several of them get stoned to death. I don't know. A whole mob started, and it was bad. Well, these Jewish pilgrims, or maybe they were locals, I don't know. There was all kinds of people that would descend upon Jerusalem for Passover time from the diaspora. They picked up their sacrifices and they ran in the temple, basically saying, I'm on base. You can't touch me, right? So Archelaus gets wind of this, and he pulls there as the new sheriff in town routine, right? He's like, no, I'm the boss. And if you think my dad was heavy-handed, he does the Rehoboam thing, and he's like, I'm going to show you what heavy-handed is. And he orders horsemen to surround the temple. He sends his whole army, basically, so nobody could leave and nobody could come in. And there's a big slaughter of 3,000 Jews in the temple. Passover was canceled. He told everybody, go home. So you can imagine there was tons of Jews coming from Alexandria and the area known as Cairo now. And they're heading back to Bethlehem. And there's these pilgrims coming on the road, meeting them, telling them probably what happened. Joseph probably was like, okay, I fled from one homicidal, crazy king, only to find out that his son is on the throne and he's worse than his dad. Yeah, this isn't so good. And then it's tumultuous times. He's warned in a dream. He goes to Nazareth instead, where, maybe he's, whatever. Anyway, so we know this, but Matthew never mentions all of this stuff about Archelaus. We hear about Archelaus like very briefly in Matthew. That's it. That's all we hear about him. And interestingly enough, as I said, Archelaus was deposed in 6 AD. Well, when did, according to Luke, Jesus first come to the temple, accompany his parents with the temple? It was when he was 12 years old. So it was 12 years later. So it's kind of like, okay, crazy guy's gone. And that's the first time we know. Now, this is a little speculative on my end, but it makes sense with the historical data that's the first time they felt comfortable having Jesus come with them to the temple. And so, yeah. When we compare this to later Christian legends about Jesus, they don't have this they don't have this kind of precise detail. Read the apocryphal accounts, read the Protevangelium of James, read the infancy gospel of Thomas. They don't have this level of precise detail. So Matthew's narrative, it feels really genuine and it feels truthful. Does that make sense, Than? I know you've heard this one before, but
yeah, no, it makes total sense.
Yeah,
I talked about this in one of my videos like last year. So,
oh, nice,
yeah,
very nice. So yeah, it's one of those cool external confirmations. Probably my favorite one. All right, so Than, this is the big reason why I brought you on here. Is I'm going to use your philosopher brain, because now he's going to talk about God is bad. Let's just say this is historical. God is bad for letting this happen. So here we go.
So yeah, when the Christian says your argument from silence isn't good enough, I say I'll mix this wonderful argument from silence, considering the historical accounting that we have of Herod, against the clear bias of the anonymous author of Matthew, and say that this story is clearly junk. The idea that not just Josephus, but that anyone wouldn't have documented that time at the end of Herod's life, when he didn't just plot, but actually went through and killed all of these children on a whim for something that doesn't even make sense, we'd see some evidence of that. But again, sure, it is an argument from silence. And the Christian will also say, here's the deal. We did some digging and we understand that Bethlehem at that time would have been between 1,300 and 1,500 people. And fine, I won't argue that. Now, there is some inconsistency with what you would consider the surrounding area. I've heard some Christian scholars just say it was a half a mile. Whoa, that's pretty precise. How did you arrive at that? How do we know that it wasn't the next 3 or 4 cities around it? But okay, let's go with the most minuscule version of this, since apparently it makes Christians feel better. And you consider that half of the kids would have been females. That leaves us with approximately a dozen, maybe 2 dozen young males. And yeah, that math is fine. Are we supposed to feel better that only 20 innocent babies were murdered? Does that make this less of a crime? Does it make it more believable? Like, what is the point you're trying to make with this? But I digress. It is possible that this happened and somehow did not get recorded in history. Fine. Let's give it its agnostic availability. And that's where I want to play for the second part, the hypothetical chance that this did indeed happen. I think that's actually more problematic for this God than the fact we just have an anonymous line author. Think about this with me for a second. God, the designer of life, who apparently sees all life as inherently dignified and with value, allows for his wise men to be led to King Herod, giving him this information that God knows what Herod will do with it, and then just has the wise men leave and not come back to Herod like they said they would, which raises suspicion, instead of just telling the wise men to go back and say, we were wrong. God has no problem with lying. We've seen it tons of times. Or how about just not taking him to Herod in the first place at all? Problem completely fixed. But okay, let's assume all this craziness has to happen. God's okay with this so far. He warns Joseph, good, we got to protect Jesus. Why not warn the other families? Were there not enough angels to send the message around? Or if we are going to interfere with the free will of man, how about an angel to go kill Herod? How about one to just soften Herod's heart or change his mind? But again, sorry, bear with me. Why does God not warn the other families? Where is their free will when God concocted all of this to fulfill prophecy, right? If you believe Matthew, you have to believe that God ordained these 20 baby boys to be murdered just so that that Jeremiah passage could get some credit. Is that worth those baby boys or the trauma to those families? They would technically be the first martyrs for the Christian religion, and yet they get
just throwing this in here real quick. That's what this day is about, is they're being commemorated, that they are the first martyrs of the Christian religion. So I don't know what brand of Christianity he came out of, but it probably wasn't more of a high church.
I think he was a Calvinist.
Okay. Maybe more of a low church Calvinist than Anglican or something like that.
Almost no credit. If this story is true, we have a God that once again, par for the course, uses murder of innocent babies as a plot device, as a tool, as an answer to prophecy, and as scapegoats for his own son. We should be worshiping those little babies. We should be setting up 20 murdered babies in our nativities. But that's not the pretty part that we want to focus on and teach our children. We just want to talk about sweet baby Jesus. This is increasingly my problem with Christianity, is the insane lens with which we view these stories in the Bible. The editing that we do as we pass it down and make it palatable. Oh, and sure, once they're fully indoctrinated and they've been through the Christmas season and all the songs that say all the nice things, and they get gifts and special cookies and stay up late and watch movies and all the wonderful things that do indeed make Christmas a magical time of the year, to them in their little brain, it's still associated with Christ and with the gift that his birth was to the world, supposedly. Not to those 20 kids. It was a death sentence. Can an all-powerful, perfect, all-knowing, all-benevolent, all-loving God not have found a way to bring his child to...
Okay, I think we get the idea there.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, because it just turned into kind of like angry ranting at that point. And I aside from the problem of evil stuff, well, I guess I'll just go into some of the stuff I'll say, and then if there's like any extra tidbits that he did talk about that I didn't cover, just tell me and I'll cover it, I guess.
No, you're good.
So I'll just say this first of all, because like throughout that, he is asking a lot of questions, like, why did God do this instead of this? Why did God do this instead of this? Yada, yada, yada. And I just want to point out that question. I mean, Cameron's said this a lot on Capturing Christianity, but questions aren't arguments, right? Nor is our inability to answer a question going to be like evidence against the Christian faith. If not having an answer to some kind of weird question is going to be evidence against the Christian faith, and not having answers to some weird questions when it comes to quantum physics, when it comes to even to your interpersonal relationships, that's going to be evidence against something. And that just seems kind of weird to say. So that's one thing. The other thing I do want to say is like we want to interpret the unclear from the clear. And what I mean by that is um we might have some kind of like moral questions, and we might have some kind of like moral confusion about this event. But I also think that we have other data that points us in a direction that's God revealed, the God that we worship, revealed through scripture and revealed to our experience and through philosophical argumentation, points to a morally perfect God. And those things to me seem pretty clear. And so when we have some things that are unclear here, we can interpret those unclear things in light of the clear things that we have, not the other way around, which is kind of what it seems like MindShift is doing. So I want to say, like, give some examples too on the whole topic of like not having an answer to a question doesn't mean isn't evidence against something. So for the audience, sorry, Eric.
Oh, no, you're good.
For the audience, imagine Eric is my wife.
Oh,
And he knows that I'm a really patient. Okay, fine. He's not my wife. He's one of my best friends, which that's true. You don't have to imagine that. But he hears that I got into a fist fight with somebody. And Eric, you already know that I'm like a really patient, loving, non-combative person. Like violence is like the last thing that I'm going to resort to, right? And you heard I got into a fist fight, and that's all you know. Is that going to make you call into question like the moral integrity of like your friend?
right.
Right. Like, no, because it's like, no, I have all this clear cut data that points to the direction that Than is a morally praiseworthy, relatively morally praiseworthy person. He got in a fist fight. I have no good reason to think that he did not have a good reason for getting into a fist fight. That's on like a character-based thing. On an evidential basis, like let's talk about miracles, for instance. There's a lot of analogy to this, right? Because he's asking, why did God save Jesus and not these other little boys? One reason, first of all, just off the cuff, might be the fact that, Jesus is God incarnate, the person who's going to defeat all evil and suffering, destroy all the rebelling gods of the nations, defeat sin and death, yada, 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 right? So, like, that's a really big deal. So that makes sense why you wouldn't at least save Jesus. But let's talk about miracles. Like, why does God heal these people, this person, instead of this person, or whatever it might be? And that might seem like an interesting question. And we have a whole entire host of literature and argumentation on the philosophy and epistemology of miracles. Eric, you've covered this countless times. I've covered it countless times. And the analogy is still there, because miracles at the end of the day are intervention based on God's behalf, on the behalf of humans. And so in the same sense, like, we can kind of look at that literature and draw these analogies. And so, yeah, we might have good reason for why God would choose to save Jesus over these other boys. But again, not having a clear-cut answer or a full answer to that question is not going to be evidentially like relevant, at least by my lights. And the last thing I kind of just want to point out is like, yeah, this is kind of like a problem of evil type thing. And so one of the things that I see a lot of atheists do when it comes to the problem of evil is they'll assume this thing called the necessity condition, pretty much, right? Like, and MindShift kind of talks about this, even kind of like makes it obvious that this is assumed in his argumentation a little bit here in the way he talks about it, because he'll say like, well, why is this necessary? And for the Christian, I think we're happy denying this necessity condition, right, which is basically this idea that God is obligated to stop all evils that are not necessary for some greater good. And I'm going to deny that. I'm going to say God is obligated only in stopping evils that make an agent's life on the whole bad. And on that on the whole thing that I'm saying there includes the afterlife as well. Right. So God is only obligated in stopping evils that make an agent's life on the whole bad. That doesn't mean he's not going to intervene in some cases in other places to stop evil and suffering for some other reasons. All that means is that for something to be evidentially relevant, whether either to the moral character of God or the existence of God, you're going to have to point to evil that can make something on the whole, on an agent's life on the whole bad. And so a child dying, yes, it's horrible, it's sad, but that evil will be defeated in post-mortem for those children. Like, and so I don't see this as morally or evidentially relevant. And I'm not trying to sound like cold and calloused here.
Yeah.
I promise I'm I'm a really tender person. It's just when it comes to philosophy, I
Yeah.
can't.
Philosophy
Um,
gets dry, and
yeah,
then, but if it's real life, and I'm
correct.
sure we both
So I
had
don't think that God
tragedies.
is
Yeah.
morally blameworthy for these as well. Some other things that I kind of just picked up on in here is just like, it seems weird to say that God chose to let this happen to draw some kind of parallel, like in the Gospels, because one, it seems to just assume a dictation model of inspiration, where I
Mm.
think Eric and I would both deny that and go for a dynamic view. Um, and two, I don't think that that was God's motive in allowing that either. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't think that it was like Herod didn't have to do that. God
Hmm.
could know what's going to happen. But it doesn't necessarily mean like he's like, let's draw these guys here so that Herod murders some children, but I'll save my son so that I can look really cool. I don't think that's necessarily God's intention, and one could even take kind of like an openness view if they really wanted to. I'm not necessarily 100% on board with that, but I mean, you could, and just say that like God knew that it was possible, but he didn't know that it was like absolutely going to happen. Now, that's not necessarily a position that I'm going to necessarily argue for, but I don't think that it's completely off the table. It's something that's a view that's held by pretty smart people like William Hasker, Richard Swinburne, and some pretty good theologians like John Sanders or Greg Boyd. Again, I don't agree with all those guys and everything, but I'm just saying that they would have that explanation at least available to them.
Yeah. And if you guys, like, for the audience too, because I probably said a lot of things that might not sound even new when it comes to the problem of evil there, if you're not used to defeat condition and all that jazz. I've covered this on my YouTube channel a lot. My friend Tim Howard on Invoking Theism has covered this. My friend Kyle Allender on the YouTube channel, Christian Idealism, has covered this as well. But if you have questions on that kind of stuff too, just reach out to me. I just can't go on a hour-long diatribe about the problem of evil and why I don't think that it works. That's all.
Right. No, I got you. And so, yeah, it just seems like there's no theological kind of reasons behind, taken into consideration here about Jesus's life. And obviously, we know how the story ends in the Gospels. Jesus is an innocent victim. If anything, he's, he never did anything wrong. At least according to Christian theology, he dies as an innocent victim with one of the most excruciating deaths. He understands and has experienced in the incarnation all of the kind of suffering and pain and tragedy that we could possibly go through. He's experienced rejection from his own family. He's experienced betrayal from his own disciples and abandonment, and then ultimately, being stripped naked and beaten and mocked and whipped and hung to a cross. And then out of that, he defeats evil, and that life doesn't end at the grave, like you said. Another thing, too, I wanted to bring up a story about a pastor in Beirut. And so there's a guy, Pastor Saeed Deeb. Some of you guys may have heard this story. Maybe you might not have, but there was a big explosion in Beirut that killed hundreds of people a few years ago. Some of you guys might remember seeing that on the news, and it did like millions of dollars of damage, right? And this particular pastor took in like refugees and different things like that into his particular church. He had like a special program and like a children's outreach and something like that. He had 34 employees working the particular day of the explosion. And they were also inviting children to do classes, which the people were, I think, to my understanding, preparing for. So we're talking about 234 people, including 200 children. Well, Pastor Deeb that morning during prayer, he just felt alarmed, and he didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. People were cooking, people were doing their work. His employees report him acting like really strange because he was basically like, he just felt like he needed to send everybody home. And they're like, we can't, we're already got all these plans. We're already doing this stuff. He got to the point where he started shutting off people's computers and basically yelling at the kitchen staff, go home right now. I don't care what you leave on the stove. Turn it off and leave. Just who cares? Well, later on, shortly thereafter, the explosion happened. And I think his building was destroyed. Those people would have been killed. So God does warn people, at least according to this particular pastor, and I don't think that he's lying, and I don't think that he was deceived, that he does spare people, including innocent children, and he does warn people. Maybe he wanted to warn more people that particular day. Why didn't he spare more people and those other people? Should those people just live with survivor's guilt for the rest of their lives because the Holy Spirit talked to their pastor and warned them to get out of that? I don't know if that seems right to say that they should just feel bad because God didn't save everybody. Ultimately, where does this end? Like, if there is no evil, it's just the eschaton. It's over. But there's reasons right now that God allows these things to happen. We may not know all of the answers as to why, but we do know that we have a Savior who endured the worst kind of evil and will at the end defeat evil, as Than, as you talked about there. And like you said, we have to look at the clear in light of the unclear. Well, here's a very clear case of somebody apparently somewhat miraculously being delivered. And there are other stories that are like that. I've done a whole stream. You've done streams. You've had people on your channel who've been healed of stomach paralysis and horrible conditions. I've had people who are on my channel that I've interviewed that were crushed by a semi truck and had 80% of their intestines removed and had them miraculously grow back to where they could eat and they were no longer starving to death, and they're walking and living today. They had a death sentence over them. They were supposed to die. And so we have to look at the positive evidence for these things, and put it into the big picture. We can't just consider evil on its own. And just to sum up, there's no historical reason, I think, a good, strong historical reason to deny that this particular thing happened. And so what I worry about a little bit is this minimizes the victims. If there were victims, which I think that there were, I don't think Matthew's lying. We have to think about what we're saying here. At the end of this is the last thing I'll say, is we're basically saying that a guy read the Old Testament, he read Exodus and some prophecies, he cooked up a story, invented fake victims because he wanted to lie about the Messiah in this really sloppy way. And that's just calling somebody stupid and contributing a pretty heinous thing to them, that they're willing to invent a story. Who makes up stories about dead children? You know what I'm saying? And but if it's true, then the victims that were killed, we're just erasing them, and that's not a good. That's not a thing that we want to do. We don't want to erase victims of a tragic crime. You know what I mean? We want to be able to remember those victims. And so I would just say, when somebody makes a very grave accusation, you better have good reasons to think that they're lying. And it can't just be some weak Moses parallels and a weak argument from prophecy and an argument from silence. You're going to need something stronger than that to just say that, yeah, absolutely, they're lying. And they're not only that, they're a creepy liar. They made up dead babies to spin a theological story.
Yeah.
So
no, I'm with you on that. And he made some kind of like psychological critiques of Christians and Christianity in general and the church and all that stuff at the end, but I didn't really want to get into too much addressing that. And all I really wanted to say with that is just that on one end, I agree on some of the aspects where I think Christians tend to gloss over some of the harder to deal with aspects of some of these narratives. But at the end of the day, like, the infancy narrative is about the incarnation of God. God incarnate has entered, like, our reality is we know it, and like that's a huge deal. Like that's the same person who will defeat the suffering of those kids. So yeah, I don't know. For me, it's a little frustrating sometimes when you just hear like a smorgasbord of complaints against the church that some of them I agree with, and it's just like, well, how is that relevant to whether or not the infancy narratives are true and whether or not God is morally justified in what happened, right? So it's like,
yeah, there's a little psychologizing on. I mean, we're parents, and we're basically being told by this atheist that we're abusing our children and giving them this baggage by telling them these stories. And I would say it's not entirely helpful dialogue. He's welcome to say whatever he wants to say it's his channel. And maybe he feels like he has good reasons to say it. And in a way I can kind of understand. If you feel like you've been raised with a harmful belief and you want to help people get out of that harmful belief, and you're trying to point to reasons why you think it's harmful, in some sense, I mean, I understand. But on the other hand, like, you and I are kind of like, this is a foreign brand of Christianity that we're not teaching our children. And you're basically kind of saying that we're abusing our kids by bringing them up this way or teaching them these things. When we're also trying to explain, like, this is a real nitty gritty reality that we live in, but there's good reasons to think that God exists and he will ultimately defeat evil. I don't see how that is like this horrifying message that is going to give them something a little bit more to deal with some of the suffering than there would be on atheism, just from an existential standpoint.
Yeah, I was going to say, it puts a lot of purpose into your suffering, because not only do you have this promise from God that he will defeat all this suffering, we also have this existential fulfillment that comes from it, because you get to partake in the redemption of reality with him, not just stand on the wayside as like this little pet that gets to suffer until he fixes everything.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, again, where does this end? It's almost as if like there should be no evil at all if God exists. And given human free will, that to me seems like an impossibility. I know some people would disagree with that, but anyway. Well, awesome. Dan, I really appreciate you coming on. Did you have anything else you want to add?
No, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate the chance to be on here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm glad. I've been on your channel several times. I don't know if you've been on mine before. Maybe you have. Yeah, I think you did when we talked. I think you talked to Derek from Myth Vision, I believe. So awesome, man. Well, again, it's Exploring Reality. Check it out. Lots of good stuff. And everybody, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this stream to be educational and helpful. And enjoy the rest of the Christmas season. And you have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody.